Hello, and welcome to Movies We Dig, the podcast about film, antiquity, and everything in between. I'm Colin McCormick.
I'm Elijah Fleming.
And I'm Christy Vogler.
And today we're back with another special episode of this new segment we're trying out where we search for meaning where there may not be any. We're calling it Extremely Strained and Incredibly Forced. And joining us today is another special guest. We're really happy to have back on the show Dr. Jeremy Swist. Woo! Yeah, we're all cheering and waving. You can't hear it, but everyone, there's flags, trumpets, the whole kit and caboodle. Jeremy, pleasure to have you on the show.
Hey, it's great to be back, guys. I appreciate the invitation.
Of course. So, Jeremy, you had actually a pretty novel take, one that I did not see coming, but I'm really excited to hear it. So talk to us about where you are finding some reception.
Okay. So when I first pitched this was based on a little pet idea I had a couple years ago that never really got off the ground, partly because of the pandemic and partly just because I think I missed some call for papers for like the Classics and Sci-Fi conference that happened like a year or so ago during the middle of the pandemic that I caught a couple papers for. But in 2018, I found on Netflix premiered I think it was a Netflix original series, and it was called Altered Carbon, and it was a sci-fi series, a cyberpunk kind of series set a little over 300 years in the future, when human beings have colonized a few worlds, but are still on Earth, and it's a highly advanced technological civilization. However, there's still a lot of wealth inequality. As you can see, it's critiquing a lot of contemporary things as sci-fi tends to do. But the main premise of this show that you have to accept is that at some point between now and this centuries away from us future, they found on a planet some sort of resource that allowed human beings to have their consciousness essentially uploaded into what they call a cortical stack, or a stack for short, that is inserted into your vertebrae in your neck. And what that essentially allows you to do is to be theoretically immortal. So the premise is that you are the consciousness in your stack, and that your human body is what they just call a sleeve, right? Or your skin. And so basically, if you can afford it, you could theoretically transfer from sleeve to sleeve. And but unfortunately, in this world, only the super rich and super wealthy can be like people who live for centuries. And they're actually called Meths, which is short for Methuselah, which is the biblical person who lived like 900 something years. And they do explain that in the show. So that's sort of the premise here. And there's a lot of cool ethical kind of questions that come out of this, idea of essentially becoming God, and then these sort of Methuselahs, these Meths kind of replacing gods in all of the power and wealth that they've accrued, and then they're functionally immortal, right? So anyway, in the midst of this context is where my crackpot theory came from, and the main story I saw connections to, or at least resonances with, the labors of Heracles. So basically, the political system in this universe, the human sort of empire between these worlds, is called the Protectorate, and it's a tyrannical, centralized political system that that upholds the practice of immortalizing people's consciousness in these stacks and all the problems that causes. And then at some point during this timeline between now and when the show is set, there was an uprising that was led by these highly well-trained kind of rebel soldiers called envoys, who were trained, to be, psychologically and, in all the martial arts and everything, and they could break through interrogations. And they were sort of the leaders of this uprising, which was ultimately put down. And at the start of the show, you learned that one of these envoys survived, and his name was Takashi Kovacs, and that's the protagonist of the show. And this is the Heracles character. So when they essentially brought him to justice, they killed him. But when you kill somebody, you don't actually kill somebody. What you do is you kill the sleeve, the body, and then you essentially hold hostage their stack where their consciousness is. And essentially punishment is a prison sentence is now basically you keep your stack on ice for however many years. And so like a century or so later, they actually spin him back up. In other words, they put him into a new body because some super rich guy, one of the meths named Lawrence Bancroft, wanted to hire him as a hitman / investigator into his own death. Okay? And this Bancroft guy is the Eurystheus figure. In other words, we have the situation where there's this bad guy because he's one of these super rich meths who, is above the law and, responsible for all the inequalities, that plague the world. And he hires this guy in order to basically do this kind of dirty work for him, mostly to investigate his own death. And these Methuselahs, what they are capable of doing and have the means to do is they have backups of their consciousness. So if they end up losing their stacks, in other words, they get RD'd or suffer real death, they can fall back on these backups and therefore prolong their lives. And only the super rich meths can really afford to do this. And so, and then he has other sleeves that are grown that have his same body rather than switching to a different body. So basically he's investigating a time when he was killed and he didn't remember like the 48 hours leading up to that because that was before it's been that long since his last backup. So
creepy.
Yeah. So that's basically the premise, and that's how the show starts. And I won't go into kind of how it develops. It ends up being a bigger, much more complicated than that premise suggests. And, there's all sorts of intrigue and betrayal. And then you end up finding out that there are greater forces at work than, this Bancroft guy and all of this. And there's sort of things about the characters that link them together in ways you didn't expect. But anyway, so the Labors of Heracles bit is basically that's sort of, once you scratch the surface, there isn't really much beyond that. Again, this is sort of the motif in a classical hero's career where they are forced to undergo labors by an enemy, and that enemy being someone who is, unjustly in power, while the hero themselves is someone who is very physically and mentally capable, as the Labors of Heracles demonstrate, that they require, physical strength, speed, endurance, but also some ingenuity to take care of the Hydra, the Stymphalian birds, and my favorite one, clean the Augean stables, which I would have thought it would have taken him less time to actually clean them than divert a river. But you do you. So that's where I'll kind of end, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. I don't know how much of it you were able to see yourselves. I ended up marathoning through the whole thing over the past 2 days on 1.5 speed because that's all the time I had for. But luckily, I managed to finish it like 15 minutes ago.
I was very close, and I hope my students aren't listening because I was very close. This is my last day before break, and I was like, what if I just canceled my classes today and just binged it like morning till now?
Right. But so the last thing before I'd love to hear from you guys, and I'll stop talking for a while, is so Altered Carbon is based on a 2002 novel of the same title by an English author named Richard K. Morgan. Okay, so there's that. But it was adapted to this television series by someone named Laita Kalogridis. And if that is not a name you've heard of, and if it is, it's because apparently, and this a grad student told me this the other day, this was the person who originally wrote the script for Oliver Stone's Alexander, or
Oh,
something like that. But
interesting.
her script was rejected, and they went with something else. But regardless, this information is useful because it makes sense of, one, the possible inspiration I have here, though certainly the novel seems to have followed that too. But also, there are other classical references throughout the series that I've noticed.
Hmm.
So, for instance, in the last couple episodes, you see a painting of Saturn devouring his children, and that has to
Hmm.
do with, I don't know how much we want to spoil here.
We usually we're pretty open to spoilers, so but
Okay.
we'll
Yeah.
just say like a heads up if
Okay,
anyone listening
this
wants
is
to
sort of
see
the
this.
major spoiler, is that Kovach's sister Ray, who basically was an envoy with him, ended up surviving, and they were reunited. But it turns out that she kind of had sold out the whole rebellion and ended up as one of these meths, and she was actually sort of the puppet master of pretty much everything that happened throughout the series. And then she was basically trying to get her brother back, and this was a very like strange kind of like obsession that this sister had in order to like be reunited with your brother, even if it meant killing everyone he loved, and like trying to turn him into this monster that she was. And so,
Right.
so this painting of Saturn devouring his children on the wall in sort of her penthouse up in the sky had some real significance. And then in the final fight scene between them, they're fighting with samurai swords because they can, and they end up stabbing each other with them at the same time. Okay, mutually, just like Polynices and Eteocles. However, it's not fatal, but it's still the fact that they sort of dwell on that image, resonated with me. And then there's other, classical references, like there's a character they refer to named Iphigenia, who was, quite inspirational, and a few others. So again, I'll stop talking. What do you guys think?
So I had actually never seen this before. It was always like on my list and I never took the time to watch it. So I knew going into it that like this was your pitch, and it was really fun to sort of be looking for it as a first time viewer. And I was like, oh, I get it. Like immediately I was like, I get it. Like I see what's happening here. And I think to me, sort of the idea of the anti-hero came up over and over again, because I feel like Kovach says, like, I'm not here to be anybody's friend. Like, I'm not here to make friends. Like, I'm not like here to help anyone. I'm not here to save anyone. And that seems like a very Heracles type of thing, where he's like, I'm not actually doing anything. Like,
yeah, and I think that's just one part of the premise that I think we just need to make clear for the listeners, is that with the Heracles comparison, is Heracles is laboring under Eurystheus in order to atone for the murder of his family after he was driven mad by Hera. And so that's essentially what Kovach is doing here. He was brought back into a new sleeve in order to essentially, if he could help Bancroft solve this murder, then he would receive a full pardon. And so this was entirely out of self-interest that he agreed to go through with this. All right, so sorry for the interruption.
No, I was just about to sort of make that point, because one of like the two thing, or not two, the things that jumped out to me most, like as like Eli was said, like I heard the pitch before I started watching the show, so I was kind of primed to, I had my Hercules hammer looking for my Hercules nails, and the key point, as you said, is like, one, it's like Hercules Heracles has to serve like an inferior person. That's like part of the stigma, right? He has to work for a guy who's like weaker, more cowardly, who's only in charge of him because of like a twist of fate. And I think in some versions there's something where Hera like speeds up his birth so he can fulfill a prophecy before Heracles. So Heracles has to work for him. Which you could argue in the same way that like Bancroft like won the genetic lottery of being born rich or something like that. And the themes of like redemption, pain, suffering, and then the violence that just surrounds these people were like one of the things about, I was lecturing about Hercules in my own myth class, and it was just talking about like, somebody said like, oh, like, what would you do with Hercules? And someone said like, put him on the football team. And I was like, well, would you want to put Hercules on your football team? Because sooner or later he's going to lose it, or someone's going to get hurt, because that's what happens where everywhere Hercules goes, even though he is this like civilizing force that gets rid of monsters and fixes up rivers and founds whatever thing, if he hangs around long enough in civilization, stuff breaks. Usually people.
Yeah. I think about this in the scene where he was in the virtual like torture machine.
Yes.
And when he breaks out, he like kills everybody in the facility.
Mhm.
And he says something like, you guys should be thanking me for getting rid of this horrible place. But it's like the amount of death and destruction that he leaves in his wake is like is horrific.
Yeah.
And I think that's the thing that we always come back to with Heracles as a character is I kind of actually agree with your student that I would put him on the football team and then just always have him playing football nonstop, because that was a space in which aggressive, violent action is socially acceptable. And it's, it's the same with football players. And like, when is it problematic is when they're off the field and that aggression is directed in ways we don't find socially acceptable. So like, I kind of maybe agree with your student, but just like he should just constantly play for like every football team that exists and never stop playing. And I think that's what I was looking for in this story too. And I think it was interesting because in episode 1, he kind of has that opportunity, right? Like he is aware that any kind of life he lives is going to be violent. And he's like, I just want one good day to like things go my way, just kind of normal, enjoy my last day. And then I want to go back on ice. Like I don't want to live this life, but then he kind of gets drawn in. He can't resist.
And if you'll permit me to push it a step further and even like even more specific kind of reference. And I'm thinking particularly with the plot line with what's the character's name? Like his sort of right-hand man and his daughter.
Vernon Elliott and his daughter Lizzie.
Yes, Vernon and Lizzie were like, to me, that reminds me of my favorite Heracles story, which is the Alcestis, where Heracles comes to town with this guy, and the deal with the guy is that the guy has gotten the favor from Apollo that he can postpone his own death if he can get somebody to die in his place. Which already you can, I mean, we can probably, this is something like you could see happening with the Mets. They would make a deal like this, but the only person that volunteers is the king's wife, Alcestis. So Hercules comes to town when she's sort of lying on the funeral pyre waiting for her own death. And at first there's a Euripides play where Heracles kind of shows up and he's drunk and rowdy, and he can't understand and gets mad at everyone for being so glum and dour and mourning. And then when he finally figures out what's going on, he goes and he fights death, and he rescues her basically from purgatory, which is kind of like what's happening with Lizzie. Sorry, where she's like trapped in this like, she's basically trapped in like a VR nightmare where like her stack's kind of messed up. I had another sort of thought that I wanted to ask Jeremy first, and this is my like literary criticism brain, which is like, as I was watching Altered Carbon, there were kind of 3 main genre influences that I was kind of really picking up on, and all of them kind of come back to, I think, can also be sort of traced indirectly back to, say, classical ideas or classical literature or culture or whatever. And so one is just like your sort of, 80s cyberpunk, Blade Runner, Ghost in the Shell, like, it's very Blade Runner-esque, just in its low, like everybody's walking around with clear umbrellas in the rain. And then the other being sort of like gumshoe detective noir, which, also kind of feeds into Blade Runner, where it's like noir and detective. It's a murder mystery just with a sci-fi twist. It's all about like, who can you trust? Who's the femme fatale? Who's the murderer? Dark alleys. And then the other one is Gothic literature, mostly via the character of Poe, who's like this hotelier who has like an Edgar Allan Poe themed hotel that our hero is staying at. And all of them also, to me, are kind of like all of those genres, mostly the Gothic horror and the cyberpunk, a little less so the detective, are also kind of very classically inspired, I feel like, in some way, shape, or form. I don't have a greater thought beyond that, but I sort of, hopefully I've given someone a nudge.
Yeah. So especially with the Gothic horror, there is definitely a lot of themes that are similar to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which stands at sort of the beginning of that genre. The idea of being able to play God and create these monsters, essentially these myths, right? These rich and powerful people who just dominate everything. And one of the, as you see toward the end of the show, one of the problems with living so long is you become bored. And so the seeking of pleasures becomes more and more extreme to the point where, we have, just really horrible extremes of carnal pleasures and the kinds of prostitution fantasies that, they can enact with all their above the law and everything, and all of the just exotic, things they have access to. So it becomes, they become essentially, by becoming gods, they become inhuman.
Yeah. And then like this is the other kind of twist, even Amber, where Bancroft is simultaneously Eurystheus, where he's this like inferior quest giver, taskmaster, boss, but he's also kind of Zeus-like in everything you just said about like living forever and seeking out more and more sort of depravities to, stimulate himself. And the other myths, they do very kind of, I would say, godlike in the sense of like stuff that Greco-Roman gods would do, like put a guy's brain into a snake, or
I was just thinking of that.
or that's a very now that we have this kind of technology, we can reenact the metamorphoses where when a mortal pisses me off, I can turn them into an animal, or trap them in purgatory forever, or throw them into Tartarus, which is just a VR nightmare that you just have get your own nightmares played back at you, for infinity.
They really show that it was Victor who is the true monster, and these are all a bunch of Victors.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And we get a fable of it too, right? We get the Patchwork Man. And I guess that's the thing where like this kind of fable that Kovacs tells his sister when they're children about Frankenstein basically situation where the Frankenstein character gets killed by the monster, and now the monster's out there eating up children. And I guess like is the Patchwork Man, I feel like we're sort of being led to suggest that the Patchwork Man is Bancroft and the other mess, right? Because they prolong their own life through a sort of parasitic pursuit, right? Where they just kind of keep getting more and more like they're a meat grinder for bodies.
Yeah, there was some other aspects with Takashi that was interesting in terms of he himself is also getting this amoral perspective of I think when he's talking to Vernon and dealing with Lizzie, and Vernon's asking, it's like, why are you helping Lizzie? And it's like, I don't actually care, but if it gets me what I want, then I'll do it. And to me, that's so connected with our understanding of the Greek gods is like they don't actually care about humanity, but they help out when it's to their advantage, or like it just works with their plan of things. And I thought that was interesting that was coming from Takeshi, who, if we think of as a Heracles figure, is eventually going to be a god himself. Like once you're fully stripped of your mortality and go through apotheosis, then you are the same as the myths at that point. And the other thing that Jeremy said this a while ago in recapping it, we have a very clear prize at the end for Takeshi if he successfully solves the murder. And that's the one interesting thing about Heracles that isn't always clear to me, is he's going to be wiped clean of his blood crime, but what inspiration beyond that? Because you never get a sense that he, like Disney's Hercules, wants to join his family up in Olympus. Like that's very manufactured in a way. But yeah, I guess that's kind of my question. Maybe going back to the original content is, what is Heracles' real motivation for completing these labors? Is it really just to have a clean slate? Or it seems like modern audience are like, that's not enough. There needs to be some kind of payoff at the end beyond that. So I was curious of what people thought on that.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question, right? What's motivating Heracles, aside from redemption being the big one?
Because that seems such a weird thing for the Greeks.
Yeah, but we'd like to think there's some kind of remorse, right? For going crazy and killing your family.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we have versions like Euripides' play where he's deeply sort of resentful and remorseful about what's happened. The blood guilt weighs on him, and it comes it comes also with other. It's not just the guilt factor of it. It comes with other caveats. When you have this kind of blood guilt on you, like you literally become like a pollutant in Greek society. Like murder, it hangs on you like a cloud, like a stink or a cloud or a noxious fume.
Well, in a shame-based society versus a guilt-based society, it's the way that your actions make you appear to your society, the people around you in your community, and how you might be harming them. And that I feel like could be a really powerful motivator.
So with Kovacs, like I feel like Kovacs very much fits into like our modern anti-hero archetype, which I feel like so often is like hero who professes to not care, but secretly does, right? That's kind of like in hard exterior, interior heart of gold, something like that.
A Sundare, if you will.
Yeah. So thinking of kind of what y'all have been talking about Kovach's motives versus Heracles' motives. As far as I know, Heracles this isn't like the Disney movie where he wants to become immortal and a god just like his parents and everything. I think all the way up to the end, he's not expecting to have to become an actual god. He thinks of himself as mortal, and he'll have the same fate. And then he just happens to ascend to being a god, when he throws himself on the pyre after Deianira gives him what my students have called the kill suit. Anyway, so it makes me think of sort of, though, with Kovach, he is someone who he was against the protectorate. He and the envoys were very much against using this technology to prolong life and the stacks and everything. And so he doesn't want to be immortal like these meths do, right? And so at the very end of season 1, he essentially, after he kills his sister and feels, very, well, not guilty, but he's sad about it, but he knew he had to do it. And he decides to go down with the ship that they're on and crash into the bay by San Francisco in flames. And he's expecting to die. He's not expecting to survive that. He wants this to be the end. But he miraculously survives and keeps going, conveniently for season 2's where he can find Quell. But anyway,
we could recast him.
And he's recast as Anthony Mackie, who is a great actor. He's one of the highlights of season 2, which is not as good, but he does a good job. Anyway, so an interesting thing happens toward the end of season 1 where Kovach, as part of their elaborate sort of plan at the end in order to overthrow Rey, is he double sleeves himself. In other words, he copies his consciousness into another stack and uses essentially a human 3D printer to create a clone of himself. So, it's like that Doctor Who finale in season 4 where there's 2 David Tennants, right? 2 doctors. Okay. There's one human doctor and one Time Lord doctor. Okay. So basically, after Kovach, the Kovach who ends up down in flames he spun back up sort of virtually after he survives that. And they say, well, yes, you were technically pardoned, except there's 2 of you. And, re-sleeving, double sleeving rather, is illegal. So one of you 2 has to actually die. And so it turns out that the Kovach who didn't go up and go down in flames is the one who ends up dying, right? And it's interesting because that's the Kovach who was going to go and sort of to this kind of pleasure island with this Bancroft's wife. I always saw as sort of a potential like Omphale character that he manages to resist.
Oh, for sure.
Right. But anyway, so some of you might know where I'm going with this. With the 2 Kovaches, there's the 2 Heracleses. There's the Heracles, and this is explained in Book 11 of the Odyssey. There's the Heracles who was mortal, who died on the pyre, whose Eidolon is wandering around the meadows of Asphodel in Hades that Odysseus sees. But even then, they know that there's also the Heracles that ascends as an immortal god. And so I don't know if, again, that's another sort of interesting parallel that I don't know it was intentional, but that's sort of, I just thought of that as I was hearing Christy and the rest of you talking about sort of what was his goal. So it turns out the one who wasn't after immortality is the one who actually earns it, whereas the meths who are always wanting it, they don't deserve it and they go down and they end up going down.
I think that's a super compelling parallel that I absolutely did not even think about. That's really cool.
Okay, I have another thing that didn't necessarily have anything to do with Heracles, but I was really paying attention to the aspect of knowledge and like passing of knowledge and storytelling. So like going back to the Patchwork Man, the way it starts out is the brother Takeshi is reading it from the book and the sister's like, no, let's tell it the way we tell it. And it became much more more of this oral history tradition being shared between them. And I liked that that connection was being brought to Frankenstein, because to me that was the Frankenstein story that maybe has gone through this, like, okay, yeah, we had a textual version, but this is the
Kind of
fairy tale
combined,
Frankenstein
yeah,
mashup
with
we
like a
got
bit of like
going.
Baba Yaga or something thrown in there, or like
Yeah.
it's very
Yeah.
Grimm's fairy tale-esque, you know, a lot of child snatching.
Yeah, and then there's this issue that is on the side of like with the neo-Catholics, of this argument of the dead should not tell tales, right? Like you shouldn't spin people up to get to accuse, to like use your knowledge that you had in your life to
Yeah.
inform people about what happened to you, what happened in your death. And I thought it was just so interesting to think about, like, how do we pass knowledge if we have this ability to live forever? And then what ways do we as humans socially like put limits on that, like through these belief systems, which I thought, like, I was fascinated by that.
I really loved the scene where Ortega brings her abuela in, like a drug dealer, like a tattooed, like
Yeah, he's
just
like a skinhead,
rando.
basically,
Yeah,
like some biker dude. Like,
it's her abuela, and she's coming home for Day of the Dead, and
mhm,
like that was really powerful and emotional in a weird kind of way. And I was like, this is doing something interesting. Like this is, and like how upset some of her family members were about the presence of a beloved dead family member, and how
mhm,
like how in the world that could be an upsetting, well, of course maybe it's upsetting because they're going to go away. It's like you, the poor in this world, rent the sleeve, right, for the night for their departed family members to be spun up in. And like
mhm,
how kind of traumatic, I guess, that can be, of just like, you have 10 hours or something with this person, and they can talk to your grandchildren and see everybody, and communicate maybe some of their knowledge. What, do they buy cheese on their way home? And you're like, no, I'll stop and get the cheese. That's like, she
mhm,
communicates some sort of generational knowledge, and she wants to experience things. Also, she's like, do you guys have any drugs here at the like police precinct? She like wants to experience more things. And I think that's a wild way of like moving this like weird
mhm.
archaeological paradigm of like, we have set generations, and they, when you're dead, you're dead. The dead don't speak. It's like, what do we do?
And it also it throws into the, because holidays like Dia de los Muertos, or I mean, even in say like ancient Rome, like the Lemuria or the Parentalia, which are all about
Hmm.
like connecting to deceased family members who have
Yeah.
passed on, and is leaving offerings, and it's a form, and sort of counterintuitively is like there's a form of communication we are having with our deceased via the offerings. And like in like in Rome, you can go to Roman sites and see these little like necropolises where they've got little like stone benches and stuff set up for people to pour out offerings for their deceased family. People would buy plots of land, or not, I mean, plots of whole these mortuaries where they would put their family members. This is the family crypt or whatever. But this technology like throws that tradition up over its own head, right? Because now like
Hmm.
it's what's the point of having like an ofrenda or something like that if like your grandma can just physically walk into the building, and then like
Yes.
it throws everything. And that's really the core of the disagreement that Ortega has, the detective
Hmm.
character, with her family and these other Catholics. It's a tradition versus modernity, right? Like, is it more ethical to spin back up a murder victim so they can identify the murderer, or like should we just let the dead lie?
Right. Well, and that's the connection I kept saying to classics again, too, is like, how often have heroes had to actually go to the underworld or seek out the dead to get the
Yeah.
information they need to
Mhm.
Exactly.
continue on their mission?
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a whole. And I mean, also the show, and really the kind of big science fiction, the scientific and ethical and philosophical question. I almost said philosophical. That's just where I'm at in the day. But also the philosophical question that goes all the way back to even like Plato or Pythagoras, which is like, how much of our identity is tied to our body? And guys in ancient Greece, like Pythagoras, would say like there is another thing, like there has to be this soul that has some kind of divine spark, call it whatever you want, ether, call it your animus, whatever. And it's like that thing. And then, I was just my Latin class, we were reading a sort of an adaptation of Ovid, where Pythagoras gets up at the end of the Metamorphoses and he gives a whole speech about the immortality of the soul and like in like what we call transmigration. But yeah, like the soul can pass on. And then that's what stacks really are. They're like, you know, it's like a thumb drive for your brain or your soul or something like that. You know, it's your animus, and then it can move. And Pythagoreans famously thought that it could go not just into other people, but it could go into animals and even certain kinds of plants, and that the soul is immortal. And, you know, our identities tied to our body. I mean, it's like it's Shipathesia stuff, right? Like,
You
know, every molecule in my body has been replaced at one point or another. You know, am I still the same Colin as I was 20 minutes, an hour, 10 years ago? And like Pythagoras would say, like, yes and no. Like, he says everything flows. It's all a river. Everything just keeps moving. And then, you know, it's a sort of a paradoxical thing. Like through changing, it's the same. I don't know.
Well, I was going to say, is like, I'm bringing out habitus now too, because I was, you know, it brings up the problem of like, oh, if you move from sleeve to sleeve to sleeve, like you have issues of like, there is some kind of something to the soul, but also like, if you're continuously changing the body you're inhabiting, it does something versus like, if you clone, like going from a same body to a same body, you don't seem to have that same effect. And I thought that was like a really interesting, like similar to habitus, where like so much of our learned sense of self is through a very physical interaction with the material world around us.
For sure.
And so I thought that was interesting. And wow, we got really scholarly.
No, but like, well, like, and like when you wake up, you're not supposed to look at in the universe. You're not supposed to look at yourself in a mirror because you'll have like an identity crisis or something. But I think there is a point, a lot of stuff now, people talking about like, we are our bodies, like vehicles is a crude way to put it, but like, the mechanisms through which I experience the world through all my senses and everything. And, you know, even like my height, the way I feel and smell and taste and touch and all that informs my experience and my identity. So it also is not quite like, you know, if you say downloaded somebody's brain into a thumb drive, is it the same kind of experience? We're getting heavy for a Friday afternoon.
And that's what's interesting about the series is the premise isn't really, we've achieved the singularity and we came up with the technology ourselves as a human species, you know, understanding it as a matter of binary computer programming. That's not actually the premise. It is, they found on some world called Harlan's World, this sort of, I think the Star Spire kind of tree or some sort of like alien organic kind of stuff that they used as sort of the substratum to construct these stacks that would contain the consciousness, and they manage. And so it's like they're harnessing an alien technology that they don't quite understand in order to do this. And so that in a way sort of keeps the idea of, is this a soul or not, sort of still out there. And kind of the theology, the theological implications become, you know, a bit less clear cut.
Not to get too like philological, but I wanted to come back to the Odyssey bit that Jeremy, you were talking about a second ago, where like there is this kind of weird contradiction where Odysseus says like, you know, I was in the underworld and I saw Hercules, his shade, you know, his ghost walking around. But there's also not the one that's also up in Olympus with Hebe getting served wine or something like that, which always struck me as kind of weird because it seems like a strange. I always wondered if that's one of those things. We talk a lot with particularly oral traditions of like, do people occasionally like go back in and like try to retcon stuff or like make stuff make sense? And that always to me struck me as a little bit of a like somebody later on in the tradition. Cause like we have sort of diverging actual like worship of Heracles in the ancient world where there's like the cult of Heracles, the mortal hero. And like when you worship a mortal hero in the ancient world, there's a set sort of way to do the ritual. Like you're supposed to sacrifice black animals and they go into the ground and there's some kind of, it's directed towards the underworld. Whereas when you sacrifice to gods, there's a different sort of mechanism and it's usually about smoky vapors going up. And so like, I always wondered if that was just like a way of like, cause there's clearly like contradictory worship of Hercules. And I think just because of the nature of, religion and worship and cult and things that, and so I wonder if always that was just like an effort by some poet, let's call him Homer, to like kind of reconcile that sense. This has nothing to do with Altered Carbon. This is just me on us, or maybe it does. I don't know.
I mean, it's about the communication of knowledge, right? And about duality. And I feel like, if we have this ability to put consciousness in two different places at once, sort of trying to live in a world where that is possible. Yeah, I mean, call it retconning if you want, but I can sort of see that happening, especially if anthropologically you're trying to embody a body, but it is in two places. It's like we have, those attachments that I think we sort of need some retconning maybe to sort of make it make sense.
I will say there was one major thing that was bugging me the whole time, and maybe it got answered later in the series, but I'm like, there's such economic inequality that exists. And like, the best of the best can like every 2 hours have them be backed up in the satellite, blah, blah, blah. The fact that every human, as far as I've seen so far, has a stack in their neck. How did that become so predominantly available to entire peoples? Because if that inequality always existed, why would everyone have them in the first place? Have that ability, that chance to preserve your identity.
Do they ever say like when and how you get your first stack?
Yeah,
like,
that's what I was like.
Do you put the stack in the baby? Or
yes.
Okay.
Like at 1 year old, I think. But Christy's right. I don't know either how that's explained. That was something that was bugging me.
This has actually made me want to read the book.
Yeah.
I'm like intrigued enough.
Yeah. I originally wanted to go and read the books in preparation for this podcast when we set it up months ago, and then the semester happened.
Of course.
I know,
anyway,
and I was going to finish grading by Tuesday.
Right. So anyway, to go back to what Colin was saying about sort of the Heracles, the two Heracles thing. So this is also kind of a philosophical thing. It is a Neoplatonic philosophical thing, and it is essentially how the OG Neoplatonist philosopher Plotinus interpreted the two Heracles thing. And basically, one of Plotinus's major kind of doctrines is that the human soul is actually double. There is a rational soul and an irrational soul that makes up sort of human psychology.
Your lizard brain, if you will.
Exactly. The irrational soul is the one that is connected to the body, engaged with the body. It is the one that experiences sensation and pleasure and pain and all of that. And that is essentially the mortal soul, right? It lives with the body, it dies with the body. The other part of the soul is the rational soul, right? And that part of the soul actually does not exist in the body. It exists up in the realm of forms, or it exists in the it's divine and exists
cloud.
In the divine. It exists in the divine cloud, if you will.
Yes.
And so basically, the human soul, the rational soul, is essentially our capacity to be logged into the cloud, right? If you will. And that rational soul never actually descends, right? We're just always in tuned to it. And it's a part of us that is up there, and it's shared with the divine. And so when a person dies, according to Plotinus, the irrational soul dies with the body. Okay, that is the part of the soul that is part of our embodied experience, all of the memories having to do with pain and pleasure and everything. But it's the rational soul that survives, and that's interesting. Approaching sort of the premise of altered carbon, which is like, and sort of also kind of questions of like, if you can download consciousness, like, and kind of represent it as these ones and zeros, like, what actually is that? Is that just the rational soul? Okay. Because how can like embodied experience be reduced to that?
Yeah.
So in altered carbon, it seems to assume that you can sort of take both parts of the soul. And that's why I think they have to resort to this alien technology to kind of get around that. I don't know. But
because you have to find some way to sort of quantify human experience in a way that could be like turned into data.
The embodied body is by its nature contextual. Like you cannot disembody the embodied body. I feel like I'm explaining something by using it in the definition.
You cannot disembody the embodied body.
Yeah, exactly.
Eli, that should go on your gravestone, right? You cannot disembody the embodied body.
And Eli's body.
I think that's called a tautology.
Lord.
The other thing that really drew me was like at the beginning, they had the very long title sequence opening, and I just was fascinated watching that. And this is just something that personally I like, is like the fact that we can go all the way to Gilgamesh and see the snake who takes the rejuvenating plant and sheds its skin. And this has been a symbol for us of rebirth and continuous life in this almost Ouroboros style, / also a little bit looks like from Full Metal Alchemist.
Yeah. I mean, same idea, but the snake
Yeah.
is the symbol for immortality. I mean, this is like classic sort of like, I guess, thinking medieval and alchemical.
I kind of love the
stuff.
idea that we continue to hold fast to that idea as a human species and are reproducing that idea past, present, and extrapolating it onto the future as well. It's like this will continue to be the thing that we all know means rebirth.
Yeah, but yeah, the snake as the symbol of immortality.
Well, and I guess that for like one more question, since we've been on the whole Marvel, what is a God thing? I got as far as episode 4. And so that was the big dilemma too, is what is God, or how has God made it?
Yeah.
They've made it so complicated by putting people in the world and messing that up. So I like that this is once again another theme we're seeing pushed into this idea of the future.
I'll posit that at least in a classical sense, or a sort of a classical paganism, polytheism way, the Methuselahs are gods, right? Where like if the main criteria is they do not die, then I think they meet that criteria.
They do.
But,
Well, and they have all of the whims and capricious shittiness of human beings wrapped up in as beings who do not die. So I think they are exactly that.
And they live in the clouds. Like, come on.
They do.
Yes, they
even
do.
live in the clouds.
Yeah.
What do they call it? The Arium? Is that what they call it?
The Arium is at least where Bancroft lives.
Yeah.
And then Sun Touched was the name of the house.
Yes.
Right.
Freaking wild.
Yeah, and we certainly see that theme in these kind of sci-fi things a lot. Like the movie Elysium is another one, right?
Yeah.
Also, we couldn't leave this unspoken, but the fact that Bancroft is played by James Purefoy, who was Mark Antony in Rome, and he's just, that's the only thing that that sort of resists sort of the whole Eurystheus sort of parallels, because I don't picture Eurystheus as being as like slick or charismatic as James Purefoy. Like I can't picture Bancroft jumping into a giant Pythos when Kovac brings whatever equivalent of the Ermanthian boar in. And I think there's another one he brought in that caused him to do that.
Yeah, Cerberus or something like that. But...
Cerberus, right? Yep.
I have some answers from someone who actually read the books. So
wait, Andy read the books?
Yeah, he loves sci-fi. So like, I stopped him and asked him about this whole: does everyone have stacks? So in the books, no. Not everyone has stacks. And actually to have a stack is to be enslaved, because people have the ability to turn the stacks off. So it's more of a controlling element.
That makes sense.
Interesting.
So they've definitely done some weird things with the show in that have confused our understanding of how the inequality works.
I guess, like having a stack could potentially indenture yourself, or like we've got the scene where the married couple who their thing is that they fight to the death for the meth's entertainment, and whoever wins gets an upgraded sleeve and whoever lose. And they have this thing worked out in their marriage where they just kill each other over and over again.
And they say like it doesn't affect the kids.
Yeah.
How old are the kids?
They're not used to it.
Yeah.
Yeah, Christy, why isn't Andy on here?
He hasn't seen the show, and he was, as I was asking, he was like, I haven't read the book in 2 years. I'm like, that's more than any of us have done.
Yeah,
so like,
read the book in no years.
Yeah.
I do know from Wikipedia that I do like Poe as the hotelier that we're working with, but originally it was supposed to be Jimi Hendrix.
I read this as well.
We all read the Wikipedia article, didn't we?
We did.
I think we got that a little bit when like Poe goes to hang out with all the other AI at the card table that one time.
I
I'm
like how
like,
Poe, he's so into like costume changes. That's I mean, I guess if I were an AI, I would be like, because he's basically cosplaying as Edgar Allan Poe at all times. But then like for Dia de los Muertos, he like has a whole get up. He puts on like a gumshoe detective outfit when, you know, they start the mystery. Like he's really into like costuming.
The bowling shirt that comes later.
So good.
do you guys think the AI is something like the Fates in this then? Because
Ooh, interesting.
they're all like, we're better than the humans. You shouldn't care about them, blah, blah, blah. Like, it was a really interesting conversation. And it's like, I definitely saw the Mevs as being the gods as we think about them in Greek mythology. But then the AI is in such a weird, interesting position because they're like, well, I can't die either. So,
Well, like their question is like, should we give a crap about humans?
Yeah.
And then, you know, some of them kind of explain to Poe that it's like, nah, just like humans are like a resource that I use for my own benefit or, you know, enrichment. But
well, and
Poe,
yeah, can't leave his hotel. So, like, he's very powerful in terms of knowledge and what he's capable of within limitations that just.
he's like Tom Bombadil.
In a way, yes. That's a weird. Yeah. Okay.
Also, I noticed, you know, one line he has where he's asked by a human character, "Can you feel pain?" And he says, "No, but I can feel anger." Okay? And you know, just kind of the idea that, you know, AIs have evolved to have, you know, human emotions and questions of, does that make it a person? And
we're back to the like, what makes a person a person? Is it, you know, the embodiment? Is it the immortal soul? Is it in this case, your emotions? I mean, there's a lot of schools of thought that say only people can have proper emotions like anger or something like that.
Right. And we're back to the replicants of Blade Runner. It's all over the place. Are you familiar with the short treks from Star Trek Discovery, or have seen Star Trek Discovery? So
I've seen the first season, not the...
Okay. So this, if we want to continue talking about like sort of the AI theme and still have classical reception in sci-fi, you know, this isn't Altered Carbon, but this is something I just want to plug here because it's like, I show it to every class I teach that reads the Odyssey. So basically Star Trek Discovery did the first season, and then in between the first and second season, they did these series of shorts called short treks, where basically they're these self-contained stories that take place in the same universe, but not really with any of the characters or just one of the characters. Anyway, this is one where it doesn't involve any of the characters. You can just watch it. So it's called Calypso. And basically it is about this guy who's the Odysseus character who is in an escape pod, and he is war ravaged, and he gets rescued by this Star Trek starship, the Discovery. And it turns out that he was tractor beamed in, and the ship actually had been sitting, and it was ordered to maintain its position by its crew that left one day. Except now it's 1,000 years later, and the crew hasn't obviously come back. And it's the ship's AI computer that's essentially, you know, the ship is sentient, that rescues this guy, brings him back to health, and essentially holds him captive because she wants a companion. And her name is Zora, and she's basically taken that 1,000 years to evolve emotions and become very human-like. But the fact that she is a computer, right, means that she can never really be compatible with this guy who wants to go home to his real human wife after all. And basically once she realizes this, she puts him on a shuttlecraft and sends him home. And chronologically, this takes place in the same time as the original series. So it's before they developed holodeck technology, where certain things could...
Where you can go in and pretend to be a detective, and then the holodeck becomes sentient and then tries to kill you, or... You know.
Yes, or you know, the...
you go back and pretend to be Robin Hood.
She can become a hologram, but it's not a physical hologram you can touch. Anyway.
I think it's just kind of cool to bring... if we bring the AI back into Altered Carbon and put them against the Meths, then like we're really competing with our ideas of what, again, is a god or a deity then. Is it immortality, the ability and power and resources to do whatever you want? Is it something more intangible than that, but it's all this knowledge and is still recognizable to humans, like we can communicate with and interact and understand? But is inherently other than us at the same time. And so I think that's really interesting. Like there's an exploration. I think there's such a strong exploration of religion in here that doesn't come off as religious.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Yeah. Now, just like remembering Ortega's partner says he's Muslim, right?
Yep.
And so he and then he has a conversation with like her mom, and like she's one of the neo-Catholics, and like that is such an interesting conversation. Yeah, about religion that doesn't feel like it's about religion. I would agree with that. Yeah.
I think that's the coolest part about this and the languages and everything is just it brings us back to humanity. And it's like we're all trying to answer the same kinds of questions, and the differences we make up between us are not that different.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, so before we let Jeremy go and call in the reception police to haul his disembodied conscious into purgatory, anyone have any final thoughts they want to just get out there?
Just that I like Frankenstein as also a strange parallel in this story. I think
modern Prometheus, man.
I mean, yeah, I think it works really wonderfully, and I thought a lot more about this than I kind of thought I was going to at the beginning. I was like, oh, altered carbon, that sounds fun. I mean, we had a really deep conversation, and so I think that was really cool that we could get to that point from a sci-fi story.
All right. In that case, I think we're gonna call it there and just leave everybody listening with a deep, lingering sense of existential dread.
Yes, exactly that.
Which is just where I like to hang out these days.
Constantly, yep.
Jeremy, thank you so much for coming on the show. If listeners want to hear or see more from you, where can they do that?
Well, at the time of recording, the state of the website twitter.com is quite uncertain. So if it still exists by the time you hear this, I am at Metal Classicist. And that's where I've done a lot of my public facing kind of engagement as a scholar and with my scholarship. And I'll really miss it if it is gone by the time you hear it. And I'm not sure where I'll end up after that. But I'm sure if I have another place to find me, they'll put those in the show notes or edit in something for me.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you can find me, on academia. I think I'm the only person in the world with my name. So I'm pretty easy to find, and I'm a pretty open person. I'm so happy to get in touch. And I just want to thank the three of you folks for bringing me back on. And even though I became convinced that the labors of Heracles was not really the intentional parallel that I originally thought it was, it turns out that because we were not kind of locked into that, I think this became a much more interesting conversation that led us to consider other aspects of the Heracles myth, as well as other themes that connect to antiquity and other areas of literature, and even philosophy or whatever. Philosophizing, right? Yeah. Very good. Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah. All right. Yeah, as usual, you can find us on movieswedig.com, and if it still exists, at Dig Movies on Twitter. You can listen to our episodes anywhere you get podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, Apple, stuff like that. Thank you again, everybody, and we'll be seeing everyone around. Bye.
Bye.
There's one of my favorite, if I can just have a quick aside, and one of my authors that I love is Nicander, who writes a whole poem about poisonous snakes, but he tells a great little myth about that humanity was going to be given immortality by Prometheus and Epimetheus, but the way it was going to get transported to them on the back of a donkey, and then the donkey stops because it's thirsty, and there's a snake at the watering hole, and the snake says, I'll let you drink from the watering hole if you give me whatever you're carrying. And the donkey says, sure. And so the donkey trades a drink of water for immortality to the snake, and that's why snakes are immortal and can shed their skin. And then Nicander also uses this part in the poem to put in an acrostic of his own name. But anyways, that was just a little fun aside.
Yeah, no, that was a weird aside that I'm just like, I just like that.
I might edit it out. Part of me I want to edit it out, but leave in the part of me saying I'll edit it out. So when people listen, they're like, what did he say? But
put it at the end.
Great, actually is a good idea.